Hello friends, we are discussing one of the important topic of abdomen, that is the peritoneum. It is a serous membrane lined by simple squamous epithelium. It lines the inner surface of anterior, lateral and posterior abdominal wall. It is developed from lateral plate mesoderm. To understand the peritoneal reflection, we need to study by discussing coronal section and sagittal section of abdomen. This is a human torso where it is divided into sagittal section by into right half and left half. This is the sagittal section of the abdomen. This is the anterior wall. This is the posterior wall of the abdomen. We are discussing the peritoneal reflection in one, how does it reflect on various organs. Second, what are the nomenclature or names given to the different folds. Third, what are the contents of each fold. Then we discuss what is the lesser sac, greater sac, and lastly we discuss what is the name given to the communication to the two sacs. Let us start. The peritoneal reflection from the umbilicus. From inner surface of anterior abdominal wall at the level of umbilicus, it continues and reflects on the superior surface of liver, the right lateral surface, left lateral surface, the inferior surface of the liver, and from there it goes to the lesser curvature of stomach and first part of the duodenum. This fold is called lesser omentum. It has two layers, anterior layer and posterior layer. Anterior layer covers the anterior surface of stomach, posterior layer covers the posterior surface of stomach. As they go on the greater curvature, they again reflect the fold of peritoneum from greater curvature to the transverse colon is called the greater omentum. From there, it goes to the posterior abdominal wall by touching to the anterior border of the pancreas. Here we discuss some minute details. The fold of peritoneum going from the anterior abdominal wall to the liver, this fold of peritoneum we call the falciform ligament. This falciform ligament looks like a sickle, therefore name is given falciform. The falciform ligament contains obliterated umbilical artery, which is a remnant of ligamentum teres, falciform artery, a branch of middle hepatic artery, and paraumbilical vein, which is a tributary of left branch of portal vein. The fold of peritoneum going from the liver to the stomach is divided into two parts. One is called the and the hepatoduodenal part. The hepatogastric part contains right gastric vessels, left gastric vessels, branches of vagus nerve and lymph nodes. And hepatoduodenal part contains the hepatic artery, bile duct and portal vein. The fold of peritoneum going to the anterior surface and posterior surface are merged and they again reflect on the greater curvature and they are called the greater omentum. Here the blue color structure is called the first layer and the red color structure is called the second layer. As the greater omentum folds on itself, the first layer becomes the fourth layer and second layer becomes the third layer. The fourth layer covers the inferior surface of the transverse colon and the second layer, which continues the third layer, covers the superior surface of transverse colon. Now, the fold of peritoneum extending from the transverse colon to the posterior abdominal wall is called the transverse mesoclone. We will restrict ourselves to the second layer. The second layer becomes the third layer, it covers the superior surface of the transverse colon and goes posteriorly on the anterior surface of posterior abdominal wall and inferior surface of diaphragm and reflects on the liver. We come to the first layer. The first layer becomes the fourth layer, and this fourth layer covers the inferior surface of transverse colon, and this fold is called the transverse mesoclone. The transverse mesoclone, the fourth layer going to the anterior border of the pancreas. The fold of peritoneum going to the posterior abdominal wall continues downwards and suspends the small intestine, and this fold of peritoneum is called the mesentery. From the mesentery it continues posteriorly, and now it reflects on the rectum. Rectum has three parts: upper one third, middle one third and lower one third. Peritoneum covers the anterior surface and lateral surface of upper one third. Middle one third covers it only anterior surface, and lower one third is not covered by peritoneum. The peritoneum covers posterior surface of posterior part of vaginal fornix and cervix. It continues on posterior surface of body and fundus of uterus. On anterior surface of uterus, it reflects up to the junction of body and cervix. It also reflects on posterior superior surface of urinary bladder and continues upwards up to the umbilicus. Now we will discuss some of the minute details and contents of the various folds. As I discussed here, the lesser omentum has two parts, hepatogastric part and hepatoduodenal part. The hepatogastric part contains right gastric vessels, left gastric vessels, branches of vagus nerve and lymph nodes. And the hepatoduodenal part contains hepatic artery, bile duct and portal vein. The greater omentum contains left gastroepiploic artery and right gastroepiploic artery and short gastric arteries. The transverse mesoclone contains middle colic vessels and their branches, lymphatics and lymph nodes, autonomic nerves from aortic plexus and extra peritoneal fatty tissue. Mesentery contains jejunum, ileum, jejunal and ileal vessels, superior mesenteric vessels, nerves related to superior mesenteric plexus, lymphatic vessels and regional lymph nodes. Then it goes downwards. Here we have to remember the fold of peritoneum, which is reflecting from the rectum to the uterus. It encloses a very important pouch, and this pouch is called the rectouterine pouch. This rectouterine pouch is also called pouch of Douglas. This is very important area where this all whatever any bleeding occurs in the abdomen, that goes and accumulates into the pouch of Douglas. This is the most dependent part in female in standing position, and from there it reflects, and anteriorly it encloses another pouch, and this pouch is called the vesicouterine pouch. In male, since the uterus is not there, we have a pouch between the urinary bladder and rectum, that is called the vesicorectal pouch, and that is the most dependent part in the standing position. After discussing all the layers and contents, now we will discuss there are two important sacs or areas. The blue color area which you can see, this area is present between the anterior abdominal wall and the greater omentum and anterior cerebral visceral omentum. This area we call as the greater sac. The red color area which is seen behind the lesser omentum and the posterior surface of stomach and the posterior to the second layer, this red color is called the lesser sac. That is a short note on lesser sac, how to write. This lesser sac is the area behind the caudate lobe, posterior surface of lesser omentum and posterior surface of stomach. This area has a roof, anterior wall, floor and posterior wall. Roof is formed by inferior surface of diaphragm, anterior wall is formed by posterior surface of caudate lobe, posterior surface of lesser omentum, posterior surface of stomach, and posterior to the second layer of the greater omentum. Posterior wall is formed by third layer of the greater omentum, the peritoneum covering the transverse colon and peritoneum covering the anterior surface of posterior abdominal wall and inferior surface. The inferior surface of diaphragm forms the roof of the lesser sac. We have one side the bigger area, that is called greater sac, and the smaller area called lesser sac. These two areas are connected by a foramen. This foramen is called the foramen of Winslow. Second name is called the adductus to lesser sac, and third name is called the epiploic foramen. This has four boundaries. It has a superior boundary, it has inferior boundary, it has anterior boundary, it has posterior wall. The superior wall is formed by caudate lobe of the liver. The inferior wall is formed by, or floor is formed by duodenum. The posterior wall is formed by, you can remember very easily by the keyword SIT. S stands for the anterior surface of suprarenal gland, I stands for inferior vena cava, and T stands for the 12th thoracic vertebra. Therefore, SIT structures are forming the posterior wall. Anterior wall is formed by free margin of lesser omentum that contains hepatic artery, portal vein and bile duct. This it has applied importance. One, whenever there is a herniation or coils of intestine may come through the epiploic foramen and they may go to the lesser sac. These form the hernia, and in that case you have to disposition the small intestine into the original position and you have to close the foramen. This is one of the important site for the herniation. Second, when you are operating on the some segments of the liver, particularly first and second segment, you have to clamp the hepatic artery and portal vein and bile duct. All these they are clamped together, and that is called the Pingley's maneuver. Most dependent area is called the Douglas pouch in the 8th question, and we have one more dependent area, that is called the Morrison pouch, and this Morrison pouch has superior boundary, inferior boundary. The superior boundary is the liver, and on the left side you have the epiploic foramen, and posterior you have the anterior surface of right kidney. This is the most dependent part in the supine position. Now we discuss the coronal section of abdomen showing peritoneal reflection. This is the umbilicus. We turn it. The peritoneum reflects on the inner surface of the anterior abdominal wall. There are 5 peritoneal folds, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, and 1 in the midline. One middle fold on the left side and another middle fold on the right side, and there is one median umbilical fold. Now there are MCQs which are framed on these folds. The lateral umbilical fold is formed by inferior epigastric artery. The medial umbilical fold is formed by the obliterated umbilical artery, and the median umbilical fold is formed by urachus. This can be memorized by remembering the keyword I, O, U. I represents inferior epigastric artery, O indicates obliterated umbilical artery, and U indicate urachus. I lift the fold. This is a fold of peritoneum extending from the posterior surface of anterior abdominal wall to the liver, and this is called the falciform ligament. It has 2 leaves. This leaf is called the left leaf of falciform ligament, and this is called the right leaf of falciform ligament. The left leaf of falciform ligament covers the superior surface of liver, anterior surface of liver. The right leaf of falciform ligament covers the superior surface, anterior surface and right lateral surface. Both the cover continues downwards and they cover the inferior surface of liver. To understand the folds of peritoneum extending from the liver to the stomach, and liver to the duodenum and need to lift up the fold extending on the anterior surface. Now, here you can see there are folds are present between the liver and the stomach. This is called the hepatogastric fold, and the fold extending from the liver to the duodenum, this is called the hepatoduodenal part. The hepatogastric part and hepatoduodenal part constitute the lesser omentum. Before going to the details of these folds, I would like to mention upper border is attached margin, left border is attached margin, inferior border is attached margin, and right border is a free margin, and free margin contains some important structures. Now, coming to the hepatogastric part contains two structures. One is the left gastric vessels and right gastric vessels. Hepatoduodenal part contains, that is the free margin of lesser omentum, contains hepatic artery on the left side, bile duct on the right side, and posteriorly you have the portal vein. Now, after understanding the lesser omentum, now we will discuss the greater omentum. The lesser omentum, as I discussed, it has two layers, the posterior layer and anterior layer. The posterior layer, which is seen by red color, this covers the posterior surface of stomach. The anterior layer of the lesser omentum covers the anterior surface of stomach, which is represented by the blue fabric. The greater omentum is a fold of peritoneum extending from the greater curvature of stomach to the transverse colon. This greater omentum has two layers, anterior layer and posterior layer. The anterior layer and posterior layer is represented by the blue color and red color. The anterior layer and posterior layer fold on themselves. The first layer of the greater omentum turns downwards and becomes the fourth layer of greater omentum. The second layer of greater omentum continues as the third layer of greater omentum. This third layer covers the superior surface of transverse colon and continues on the anterior surface of posterior abdominal wall, continues upwards and covers the inferior surface of diaphragm, and from there it reflects on the superior surface of liver. The fold of peritoneum going from the stomach to the diaphragm is called the gastrophenic ligament, and the gastrophenic ligament contains inferior phrenic artery. We have fold of peritoneum extending from the stomach to the splenic, and this fold of peritoneum is called the gastrosplenic ligament. This gastrosplenic ligament contains short gastric artery and the left gastroepiploic artery. Here you have the spleen, and from the spleen to the posterior abdominal wall we have fold of peritoneum. That fold of peritoneum is called the linorenal ligament, and this linorenal ligament contains splenic artery and tail of pancreas. Another fold of peritoneum extending from the stomach to the colon, that is called the gastrocolic fold, and that gastrocolic fold contains right gastroepiploic artery and right gastroepiploic vein. The fourth layer of the greater omentum touches the anterior border of the pancreas. Here is the pancreas, and it covers the touches the anterior border and reflects downwards. Pancreas is a retroperitoneal organ except the tail part, which is covered from all the surface by peritoneum fold. The fourth layer of greater omentum goes posteriorly on the inferior surface of transverse colon, and from the transverse colon go to the posterior abdominal wall, that is the anterior border of pancreas. This fold of peritoneum is called transverse mesoclone. It reflects on the posterior abdominal wall and covers the anterior surface of duodenum except proximal 1 inch of the first part of duodenum. Then again goes posteriorly, and from there it suspends small intestine, and this fold of peritoneum is called mesentery. Here you need to remember the root of mesentery is the structure extending from the duodenojejunal junction to the right sacroiliac joint. It extends on the left border of the second lumbar vertebra to the ileocecal junction or right sacroiliac joint. This fold of peritoneum is called root of mesentery. This is the root of mesentery, and this root of mesentery one of the important contents and structure. Root of mesentery contains jejunum, ileum, jejunal vessels, ileal vessels, and superior mesenteric artery and superior mesenteric vein. This fold of peritoneum or root of mesentery crosses some important structure. This is another question which is asked frequently in the examination. This root of mesentery crosses third part of duodenum, then the right psoas major muscle, the genitofemoral nerve, and right gonadal vessels. This fold of peritoneum goes posteriorly and again descends downwards and covers the anterior surface of ascending colon. This is the ascending colon and covers from all the surface and descends and covers only anterior surface of the descending colon, and from here it continues downwards. The fold of peritoneum covers the anterior surface of the descending colon, and from there it covers the sigmoid colon from anterior surface and posterior surface. The sigmoid colon is a peritoneal organ and reflect down on the rectum. Here you need to understand that the upper one third is covered by peritoneum anteriorly and laterally. Middle one third is covered only from the anterior surface, and lower one third it does not have peritoneum. This peritoneum reflects posteriorly on the posterior surface of uterus, that is cervix part, then the body part, and continues on the superior surface of fundus of uterus and goes anteriorly and continues on the superior surface of urinary bladder, and from the superior surface of urinary bladder it continues as the posterior layer of the anterior abdominal wall. Now here you have to understand the pouch are there, these are called pouches. The pouch or the space between the rectum and the posterior surface of uterus is called the rectouterine pouch, is also called the pouch of Douglas. This is the most dependent part in the erect position, that is one. Second, fold of peritoneum extending from the uterus to the bladder, this pouch is called the vesicouterine pouch. In case of male, uterus is not there, therefore the pouch is called the vesicorectal pouch. This is the most dependent part in case of the erect position. Hello friends, today I am excited to share a video of a linear diagram showing the peritoneal reflection. Draw an oval in the center of the page, and on the anterior side label as anterior abdominal wall. On the posterior side label as posterior abdominal wall. Label as a respiratory diaphragm on the upper curvature and pelvic diaphragm in the lower curvature. Draw a circle in the center of anterior abdominal wall representing umbilicus. Draw a triangle of green color structure. The apex of the triangle pointing anteriorly, it represents anterior border of pancreas. Label as P. Draw a triangle representing liver in the upper part of a oval structure and label it as liver. Draw a transverse section of the stomach, label as stomach. Draw one more circle of transverse section of transverse colon, label as transverse colon. Draw one more circle below the transverse colon representing small intestine, label as small intestine. Draw rectum in the lower part and label as rectum. Draw a pear-shaped organ anterior to the rectum and label it as a uterus. Draw a organ representing urinary bladder anterior to uterus, label as urinary bladder. Now we will discuss how the peritoneum is reflected on various organs. Before proceeding, we should know what are the different colors used for the different peritoneum. The green color is used to display the parietal peritoneum. The blue color is used to display the anterior lamina of visceral peritoneum, and red color is used to demonstrate the posterior lamina of visceral peritoneum. Now let us start. The journey starts from the posterior surface of anterior abdomen wall at umbilicus. Now let us start. We are starting from the umbilicus and we reaches to the inferior surface of respiratory diaphragm. And this is the parietal peritoneum. From the diaphragm, it reflects on superior surface of liver. This is called the anterior lamina of falciform ligament. It reflects on the superior surface, anterior surface, and continues on the inferior surface of liver. And from there, it reflects to the lesser curvature of stomach. This fold of peritoneum is called anterior lamina of lesser omentum. The same anterior lamina reflects on the anterior surface of stomach, and at the greater curvature it reflects downwards and it folds on itself. This is called greater omentum. The layer which is present anteriorly is called the first layer and it folds on itself, and this is called the fourth layer of greater omentum. The first layer becomes the fourth layer and it reflects on the inferior surface of transverse colon, and from there it goes to the anterior border of pancreas. It covers the inferior surface of pancreas, go to the posterior abdominal wall, and from there it sends a fold which covers the small intestine from all the surface, and this fold of peritoneum is called mesentery. The same fold continues posteriorly and it covers the upper 1/3 of rectum anteriorly and laterally. In the middle 1/3 of rectum it covers only anteriorly, and in lower 1/3 it doesn't cover the peritoneum. From there it continues on the upper posterior part of the vagina, that is posterior fornix, and continues on the posterior surface of cervix, posterior surface of body, and cover the fundus. Turns anteriorly and on the anterior surface of uterus at the junction of cervix and body, it reflects on the posterior superior surface of urinary bladder, and from there it continues as a posterior layer of anterior abdominal wall and it continues to the umbilicus. Now let us study the posterior lamina of visceral peritoneum. We start from the inferior surface of diaphragm and it present on the superior surface of liver and interior surface of liver, cover the inferior surface of liver, and from there it goes to the lesser curvature of stomach. It forms the posterior lamina of lesser omentum. The posterior lamina covers the posterior surface of stomach and reflects on the inner surface of first layer, and this layer we call the second layer of greater omentum. The second layer, as it folds on itself, continues and forms the third layer. And this fourth layer covers the superior surface of transverse colon and continues up to the anterior border of pancreas, and this forms the posterior lamina of transverse colon. From there, it covers the superior surface of pancreas, and from there, it is reflected on the anterior surface of posterior abdominal wall and goes to the inferior surface of respiratory diaphragm.